The official story of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair is a mathematical insult. Mainstream history expects you to believe that a sprawling metropolis of over 200 colossal neoclassical palaces was engineered and constructed in less than 24 months in a freezing, unnavigable glacial swamp. To explain away this impossible timeline, they invented the ultimate alibi. They claimed the entire city, a masterpiece that visually rivaled Rome at its peak, was just a temporary stage set made of plaster, hemp, and wood. A fake city that was conveniently erased by fire just months after the gates closed. But plaster is a fireproofing material. It does not burn, and you cannot drive tens of thousands of timber piles into frozen mud in a matter of months. At Titan Metrics, we do not evaluate romantic fairy tales. We audit the raw physical data. We are going to calculate the soil bearing capacity of the swamp, the catastrophic thermal curing limits of wet plaster in a sub-zero winter, and the impossible electrical infrastructure of the White City. The 200-palace mirage ends right now. Let's begin. To understand the scale of this deception, you must first look at the ground they allegedly built it on. In 1890, Jackson Park was not a pristine building site. It was 690 acres of unusable, shifting, highly saturated glacial marshland. It was a bog. To build a city of this magnitude, the foundational engineering alone requires a timeline that instantly destroys the official 24-month narrative. The landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, was supposedly tasked with dredging this swamp to create a complex network of navigable lagoons, canals, and structurally sound islands. The official record claims that over 1 million cubic yards of earth were excavated and moved. Let us run the logistics. 1 million cubic yards of wet, heavy clay and marsh muck. In 1890, you do not have modern diesel excavators. You are relying on steam dredges and horse-drawn scrapers. A standard horse-drawn cart of the era holds roughly 1 cubic yard of wet earth. That is 1 million individual cart trips through sinking mud. But this wasn't happening in a vacuum. This was Chicago. You must factor in the brutal Midwestern winters of 1891 and 1892. For 5 months of the year, the ground in Chicago freezes solid. Dredgers freeze. Wet mud turns into impenetrable permafrost. The working window is mathematically slashed in half. Yet we are told the earthworks, the foundation pilings, the shoreline reinforcements, and the subterranean infrastructure were fully completed in time to erect 200 massive structures. Let us load the foundation physics into the simulator. To build colossal buildings on a swamp, you must drive heavy timber piles deep into the mud until they hit solid bedrock. If a single palace requires 5,000 structural piles to prevent it from sinking into the bog, you are looking at hundreds of thousands of massive, old-growth tree trunks for the entire city. These trunks had to be harvested, shipped across the country, and violently hammered deep into the glacial clay by primitive steam drivers. If even a fraction of these piles hit a soft pocket of unseen mud, the entire structural integrity of the palace above is compromised. If you build a structure with 14 acres of floor space on top of soft, saturated clay without perfect bedrock anchoring, you experience catastrophic differential settlement. It is the physical equivalent of trying to build a modern skyscraper on top of a wet sponge using wooden toothpicks. The immense weight of the structures would cause the buildings to sink, warp, and violently crack apart within weeks. But the White City stood perfectly level. You cannot stabilize a 690-acre swamp
drive tens of thousands of deep timber piles through frozen mud, and lay the flawless groundwork for a heavy metropolis in a matter of months. The timeline is not just optimistic, it is a physical impossibility.
When architects and structural engineers question how these colossal palaces were built so fast, mainstream historians deploy their ultimate defense mechanism, a material called staff. The narrative claims these buildings were not permanent stone. They were temporary stage sets, a crude, fast-drying mixture of plaster of Paris, hemp, jute fiber, and Portland cement, slapped onto massive wooden and steel frames. Let us audit the material footprint. Look at the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building. It consumed 44 acres of floor space. To frame this building and 200 others, the official ledger states the fair consumed roughly 100 million board feet of lumber. To physically assemble 100 million board feet of timber into complex, load-bearing domes and arches in 18 months requires a level of architectural mass production and synchronized labor that absolutely defies the era's safety and engineering limits. But the wood is just the skeleton. Let us look at the skin, the staff.
Plaster of Paris is a water-based compound. To make it, you mix dry powder with massive amounts of liquid water. Remember, construction was heavily underway during the freezing winter of 1892. When you mix plaster with water in sub-zero temperatures, the laws of thermodynamics take over. As water freezes, its cellular structure expands by 9%. In Chicago, the expanding ice crystals would have violently shattered the wet plaster from the inside out, turning intricate statues, Roman columns, and massive arches into pulverized white dust before they ever dried. Mainstream historians will tell you they solved this by using steam heaters inside the unfinished buildings. Run that logic. You are telling me they built a temporary, city-wide, industrial-scale steam heating grid to artificially warm millions of cubic feet of open-air construction sites in a sub-zero Chicago winter? Think about the sheer volume of fuel required. To artificially heat that much empty space, you would need to burn thousands of tons of coal every single day. Imagine the logistical nightmare of navigating massive, heavy, horse-drawn coal wagons through a frozen, muddy swamp, actively dodging the construction of 200 palaces just to keep the plaster from shattering. It is an operational traffic jam that mathematically collapses in on itself. The thermodynamic energy consumption alone would bankrupt the project before the plaster even dried. When you look at the crisp edges of the cornices, the perfect load-bearing arches, the sheer monolithic weight of these structures, you are not looking at temporary hemp and frozen plaster. You are looking at a permanent city.
Now we enter the most glaring anomaly of the 1893 World's Fair, the kinetic energy grid. In a time when most American cities were entirely lit by low-pressure gas, and rural America was still living by candlelight, the White City was suddenly, miraculously electrified. The official record proudly states there were over 100,000 incandescent lamps, thousands of high-voltage arc lights, and massive electric searchlights sweeping the sky. Let us run the infrastructure scan. To wire a city of 690 acres with 100,000 electrical lights requires hundreds of miles of heavy copper wiring, step-down transformers, and massive switchboards. Mainstream history admits they buried this highly complex, highly dangerous high-voltage wiring underground, using lead-sheathed cables buried in wooden troughs. Let that sink into your logical mind. George Westinghouse deployed alternating current at extremely high voltages. We are talking about experimental, highly dangerous electrical engineering deployed at an unprecedented urban scale. To insulate this grid underground, in an era before modern polymers, they relied on primitive rubber and lead. In a highly saturated glacial marsh, the freezing winters cause frost heave, the ground physically swells and shifts. This subterranean shifting would instantly crack those brittle lead sheaths, exposing raw high-voltage wires to the standing groundwater. If a single subterranean trench floods, the resulting electrical short circuit would cause a catastrophic chain reaction, burning out the generators and electrocuting the workforce. Yet we are told they laid this grid safely, securely, and seamlessly in the freezing mud just months before opening day. But the electricity was just the beginning. They also installed a massive deep trench pumping station to power colossal water fountains and manage raw sewage for a population the size of a modern metropolis. They built the intramural railway, the first elevated electric transit system in the world, snaking flawlessly through the park. You do not build a custom subterranean high-voltage electrical grid and a massive deep bedrock water purification system for a temporary 6-month stage play. This level of infrastructure requires years of meticulous urban planning, deep trench excavation, and permanent waterproof foundations. It is the undeniable physical print footprint of a legacy city, an old-world stronghold being hastily repurposed, wired up, and rebranded as an exhibition.
The physical impossibility of the buildings is only half the fraud. The human logistics are equally staggering. The official gate receipts claim that over 27.5 million people visited the Exposition during its 6-month run. Let's break down that number. That is roughly 150,000 people a day, every single day, for 6 months. On Chicago Day, they claim an astonishing 716,000 people attended. In 1893, there were no commercial airlines. The interstate highway system did not exist. Everyone arrived by train, by boat, or by horse. To move 700,000 people in and out of Jackson Park in a single day, the rail lines would have to process a fully loaded passenger train every few seconds without a single mechanical failure. Where did these people sleep? And more importantly, how did they survive? The population of Chicago was just over 1 million. The city would have had to instantly double its housing capacity, its food supply, its clean water distribution, and its waste management. Think about the human biological load. 700,000 visitors in a single day generate thousands of tons of raw human waste. Without a hyper-advanced deep bedrock pressurized sewer system already fully operational, a temporary fairground of this magnitude would become a biologically lethal epicenter for cholera and dysentery within 72 hours. Where is the archaeological or historical record of the colossal sanitation crisis this would cause? You cannot dump 27 million tourists into an 1890s urban center without breaking the biological and logistical limits of the city. The numbers read like inflated propaganda, designed to justify the massive scale of the architecture. If you find an empire of stone and need to explain its sudden existence, you invent an event so massive, so globally unifying, that no one questions the impossible math behind it.
Every forensic audit eventually leads to the disposal of evidence. How do you hide an impossible city once the exhibition is over? How do you prevent the public and civil engineers from realizing that these buildings were permanent, structural marvels of a different era? You burn it. The official narrative states that following the close of the fair, a series of massive fires swept through the grounds, burning the magnificent palaces to ash. Let us load the chemical composition of the city into the thermal simulator. Stop and apply basic chemistry. The core material of the official narrative is staff, plaster of Paris, Portland cement, and fiber. Plaster of Paris is calcium sulfate hemihydrate. It does not burn. It is inherently fire resistant. In fact, it is an endothermic material. When exposed to extreme heat, it actually releases chemically bound water molecules, actively cooling the surface and starving the fire of thermal energy. It is literally used as a commercial fireproofing material. Trying to burn down a city made of plaster is the thermodynamic equivalent of trying to incinerate a fire extinguisher with a match. Yes, the internal timber frames burned, but the plaster did not vaporize. When the wooden frames collapsed, millions of tons of hardened cement, iron, heavy steel trusses, and shattered staff would have created a catastrophic debris field. Where are the logistical records of the multi-year cleanup effort? To haul away the twisted iron and heavy rubble of 200 palaces, you would need a continuous, unbroken convoy of horse-drawn scrapers stretching from Chicago to New York. The streets of the city would have been paralyzed by the excavation traffic for years, yet the history books claim the site was cleared with magical efficiency, leaving behind pristine RAS and gentle lagoons. You do not simply sweep up a pulverized metropolis and turn it back into a park overnight. The cleanup logistics are just as impossible as the construction. And what about the Palace of Fine Arts? The one monumental building that miraculously survived the fires, standing today as the Museum of Science and Industry. The narrative claims it was the only building constructed of permanent brick and stone, allegedly to protect the artwork, but apply the logic. If staff was truly the revolutionary, hyper-efficient, weatherproof miracle material the history books claim it was, why revert to slow, expensive masonry for just one building? Because the Palace of Fine Arts proves the lie. It was a permanent building, and Titan Metrics asserts that it was not the only one.
The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition was not a temporary fairground built in 24 months. It was a staggering complex of hyper-advanced infrastructure, discovered, repurposed, plastered over to hide its true origins, and then intentionally destroyed when its existence could no longer be justified. They sold the world a 200-palace mirage, but physics does not lie. Thermodynamics do not forget. The White City wasn't built. It was occupied, and then it was executed. So, we turn the investigation over to you. If a frozen swamp cannot support a metropolis, and if a city-wide outdoor steam heating grid is a thermodynamic absurdity, what is the most scientifically sound alternative? Are we looking at a lost civilization's capital city that was dug out of the mud? Or did a breakaway syndicate possess rapid geopolymer casting technology that allowed them to print stone buildings like 3D models? Let us audit the theories in the comments below. If you think building a fake Roman Empire in a Chicago swamp was the ultimate defiance of physics, you are vastly underestimating the mechanical impossibilities buried around the world. Because thousands of miles away, an ancient workforce didn't just build temporary walls. They moved 100 tons of solid, mirror-polished black granite. And they did it entirely underground, in pitch-black tunnels, forcing massive sarcophagi around impossible 90-degree turns with zero clearance. The forensic audit of the Serapeum of Saqqara's 100-ton paradox is opening on your screen right now. The ledger remains open.